Lost in the melee of comments about whale psychologists and jokes about Puerto Rico being literal trash was a comment Trump made in his big Rogan interview, reaffirming an economic program that is nothing short of radical. Insane might be a better word for it. Take a listen.
Did you just float out the idea of getting rid of income taxes and replacing it with tariffs?
Well, okay.
Were you serious about that?
Yeah, sure. But why not? Because ready? Our country was the richest relatively in the 1880s and 1890s. A president who was assassinated named McKinley, he was the tariff king. He spoke beautifully of tariffs. His language was really beautiful. We will not allow the enemy to come in and take our jobs and take our factories and take our workers and take our families.
So this is far from the first time Trump has floated this particular economic program. You might be familiar with him waxing poetic about how tariffs the most beautiful word and how fantastic Gilded Age President William McKinley was. Ironically, McKinley's Spanish-American War is what led to Puerto Rico's acquisition as U.S. territory, but I digress. Now, I know it's somewhat folly to take all of Trump's utterances totally seriously. He promised everyone health care after all, and here we are all still waiting. But between Trump, his main funder Elon, and a host of new right influencers, we can discern the outlines of a true ideological agenda that is equal parts radical and regressive. What's more, in my opinion, we should be evaluating presidential contenders based on their stated plans. After all, what else can we really go on? And the idea of eliminating the income tax entirely and replacing it with tariffs is quite a plan. Now, the impact of such an approach is pretty obvious. Across-the-board tariffs will make prices on all imported goods skyrocket. Prices on everything from bananas and gas to electronics and housing, they will all go up. The inflationary spiral will also likely trigger additional price gouging by corporations using the excuse of inflation to further jack up prices. This is exactly what we saw during the post-COVID inflation spike. Now, the shift from income tax to tariffs to fund the government would also be wildly regressive, meaning that the poorest among us will pay the most in taxes as a percent of their income, and the richest will pay the very least. After all, the poor pay vastly more of their income on things like groceries, gas, and other consumer items than the rich do, for whom these expenses are comparatively trivial. In fact, a core reason for the creation of the income tax was in order to combat Gilded Age inequality and to be able to tax the rich, a goal Americans, of course, continue to share to this day. There's also a very obvious practical problem with this policy, which is that it would be impossible to impose a tariff large enough to make up the loss of the income tax. Tariffs represent just 2% of the current federal government budget. The other 98% is largely income taxes and payroll taxes. We currently import roughly $3 trillion of goods every year, but the federal budget is $6.75 trillion. So even if you put 100% tariff on every imported good, you would still not raise enough revenue to fund half of the federal government's expenditures. Not to mention that applying tariffs will lead to a reduction in foreign trade, which will further reduce the amount of tariff revenue, creating a doom spiral for the federal government's budget. Now, I don't know if Trump knows or cares about this basic math, but I do know for the billionaire anarcho-capitalist aligned set that is backing his campaign, people like Elon Musk, people like Peter Thiel, the fact that relying on tariffs instead of income tax would require dismantling most of the federal government is a feature, not a bug. In fact, maybe even more significant than Trump's utterances on the campaign trail are Elon's. He is, after all, Trump's biggest funder. He's running substantial parts of his campaign. He's running an entire tech company on Trump's behalf and has been promised a powerful government-wide role with which he could drive his own ideological ends. He and Peter Thiel were also influential in getting their ally, J.D. Vance, on the presidential ticket to further their influence in the administration. So what is it exactly that Elon wants? Well, in part, he wants to bolster his own bottom line since he already is one of the federal government's largest contractors. He also wants his various legal regulatory issues with the federal government to disappear. But from an ideological perspective, we know he, like others in the libertarian tech elite set, is a fan of Argentina's anarcho-capitalist president, Javier Milei. Now, you can catch glimpses of Elon's ideological goals when he talks about how many government agencies he wants to abolish, when he asserts that he wants to cut $2 trillion from the budget, which is more than the entire federal government discretionary budget. Also, when he describes all government spending as inherently bad, and when he says that Americans will have to go through temporary hardship to deliver his imagined libertarian utopia. Now, I don't think a lot of Elon fans pay too much attention exactly what Elon says. They just think he's like cool, smart, and based or whatever. But it is worth listening carefully to such a powerful individual.
But we set up Doge.
Yes.
How much do you think we can rip out of this wasted $6.5 trillion Harris-Biden budget?
Well, I think we can do at least $2 trillion.
Yeah!
Yes.
$2 trillion.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're being taxed. You're being taxed. All government spending is taxation. So whether it's direct taxation or all government spending, it either becomes inflation or it's direct taxation. Your money is being wasted, and the Department of Government Efficiency is going to fix that.
We have to reduce spending to live within our means. That necessarily involves some temporary hardship, but it will ensure long-term prosperity.
So these comments are all in line with that anarcho-capitalist dream of dismantling government, effectively letting corporations run wild. As detailed by Sam Butler over at Dropsite, Elon has also ominously incorporated a new company, officially making him the CEO of, quote, United States of America, Inc. Now, if you want to see how well this libertarian dream goes in reality, you might take a gander at Argentina, where Javier Milei is doing his best to put radical anti-government, pro-corporate policies into place. In this new laissez-faire paradise, poverty has skyrocketed to over 50%. Over 3.4 million Argentinians have been pushed into poverty in this year alone. Pensions are frozen, social safety nets slashed, soup kitchens cut, and all public works projects have been stopped. The type of global institutions that routinely imposed economic shock therapy on poor countries are celebrating this self-imposed shock therapy. But judging by Milei's popularity nosedive, the people of Argentina are somewhat less impressed. Now, some in the J.D. Vance, Thiel, David Sachs tech world are also influenced by the ideas of new right intellectual Curtis Yarvin, who argues for a complete dissolution of the federal government and abandonment of democracy at all in favor of a patchwork of corporate fiefdoms. In his imaginings, these fiefdoms would be run by a CEO king with total control. You can see how Trump might find that idea somewhat appealing. You would lose your status as a citizen, but instead you'd have the rights of the customer, namely the right to complain impotently to customer service and to depart for a different corporate fiefdom if you are still unhappy, assuming that is that another locale is willing to permit your immigration. Now, I know this all sounds kind of insane, but it's somewhat closer to reality than you might actually think. Special economic zones have proliferated around the world by the thousands, where the needs of corporations are in fact king. In addition, dozens of for-profit charter cities have already been launched, largely in developing countries, and many with the backing of J.D. Vance's main benefactor, Peter Thiel. What's more, Trump's shift on cryptocurrency, a key ideological commitment for Elon and the tech libertarians, is also a crucial indicator that Trump is bending more to their will than the reverse. After all, they have a fully formed ideology, and that is a powerful weapon. Trump, on the other hand, has an ego and some reactionary instincts and is also very easily manipulated. Now, it might seem like Trump's old-school protectionism is an odd fit for these anarcho-capitalist types, but the zero-income tax policy, which was wholly absent from previous Trump runs, is what helps make this alliance work and helps it make some sense. And in the presidency of William McKinley, they can find a sort of shared, imagined utopian vision. As Jeffrey Cabaservice, a historian of republicanism, told The New Republic, the GOP has formed a cult around McKinley, largely because he was the last pre-progressive Republican president. Time was when conservatives loved Theodore Roosevelt, but many now think of him as a big government warmonger, rightly or wrongly. McKinley, in this light, appears as the last standard bearer of republicanism's lost Eden, when government was comparatively tiny, yet strong enough to make the country a great power. So in McKinley, Trump gets his tariffs, and the Ayn Rand set gets their dismantled pre-New Deal federal government, an ideal landscape for the will of corporate CEOs to trump the will of the people. Trump also seems to find McKinley appealing because he was assassinated in office, a fate Trump, of course, himself narrowly escaped. Interestingly, though, McKinley's final speech was an effort to explain why he wanted to roll back some of the tariffs that he himself had previously championed. The period of exclusiveness, he said, is past. The expansion of our trade and commerce is the pressing problem. Commercial wars are unprofitable. A policy of goodwill and friendly trade relations will prevent reprisals. Reciprocity treaties are in harmony with the spirit of the times. Measures of retaliation are not. If perchance some of our tariffs are no longer needed for revenue or to encourage and protect our industries at home, why should they not be employed to extend and promote our markets abroad? Sounds like a regular neoliberal there. In other words, by 1901, America had already soured on the economic program, which had helped to fuel the wild inequality of the Gilded Age, pushing forward towards a progressive tax system and ultimately the New Deal programs that redefined the federal government's relationship to the masses. Of course, it should surprise no one that today's robber barons are anxious to turn back the clock all the way to that era. Remains to be seen how successful they might be in implementing their vision. But I wouldn't underestimate them either. Billionaires have more or less had their way with America for decades, and it's kind of hard to see that changing anytime soon. So, Saagar, very curious for your take on what.
Hey guys, if you want to see what I had to say to Krystal's monologue, not just this one, all of them, going back to the very beginning, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com.